Welcome everyone to the GFTU Education Trust Working Class History Series in partnership with the Marx Memorial Library and the Working Class Movement Library. My name is Meirian. I'm the director of the Marx Memorial Library and Workers' School, and I'm sat here this evening. Just very briefly to introduce the MML, we're the leading research and education centre on Marxism and socialist history. I'm particularly excited to be chairing this evening's event, well, for a few reasons. I'll come on to the wonderful speaker in just a moment. But the subject of New Unionism and Eleanor Marx, our wonderful building 37A Clerkenwell Green, has close ties to Eleanor and her life. This is where the Social Democratic Federation actually met in the late 1800s, which Eleanor Marx was obviously a member. We also have some Eleanor Marx collections. We have 3 examples of her handwriting in the library, and obviously lots of her printed works. And most importantly, kind of her spirit continues to inspire us today. Her work as a Marxist feminist and her trade unionist in particular, we keep her kind of spirit alive, I hope. And this evening is another example of that important work, I think. This evening's event is a Zoom webinar, which means you can see us, but you can't see each other. But do use the chat. But to ask questions, please use the Q&A. It's really important so we don't lose the questions. And that's just a little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Tonight is the second session in our kind of joint programme this year. And as I said, it's on New Unionism and Eleanor Marx. We'll have about 40 minutes from our wonderful speaker, Dana, followed by an opportunity for questions and answers. And we'll finish up by 8:30. We want to remind everybody that during the call, we'll be following the GFTU Educational Trust behaviour statement, which is in the chat at the moment. And now it's an absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dana Mills. Dr. Dana Mills is a writer and activist. She fundraises and writes for Plus 972 magazine, an online platform founded by and publishing Palestinian and Israeli journalists. Dana is an author of 5 books: Dance and Politics, Rosa Luxemburg, Dance and Activism, One Woman's War, and a Hebrew edition of Rosa Luxemburg. Following and drawing upon the publication of Rachel Holmes' groundbreaking biography, Eleanor Marx, Dana has been writing and publishing on Eleanor for a while now, and she's currently working on a book manuscript on radical Jewish women opposing fascism and militarism. Dana's also got a lovely long-standing relationship with the Marx Memorial Library, so it really is an absolute pleasure to be with her on this platform with her this evening. So welcome, Dana, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Meirian, and thank you everyone for joining. It's a very great pleasure to be here tonight, and it's especially a great pleasure and honor to speak of Eleanor and to speak of Eleanor with Meirian. I think we have like a 3-way relationship going back a while. So I'm going to talk a little bit about background and history and context, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about how she informs us today, because the thing I feel, I've been writing about Eleanor for about 7 years, I think, something like that. And I've always felt that she speaks to whatever moment that I'm living in. And I feel that that's a great resource that she can give beyond knowing her life story, which is valuable in itself. So I also invite you to sort of think about that and to ask questions about that, and not just like the historical details, which are fascinating in their own right. So without further ado, I'll jump right in. In 2014, Rachel Holmes's biography came out and not only broke new grounds in terms of archives, it also brought back Eleanor into conversation. It brought Eleanor back into political discussions. It brought Eleanor back into historical discussions. Karl Marx's youngest daughter, we'll get back to that in several points of the talk. Trade unionist, socialist, feminist, really important to say in this context. That's something that will also return a lot. Her father's first biographer, something that is crucial when you write about biography to think about. She was an internationalist, and she was one of the most central figures in the new unionism and in kind of the formation of the trade union movement in Britain and in Europe as we know it today. Apart from that and her incredible biographical achievements, she was also a really fun person. That's something that comes very strongly from the book. Her parents named her from childhood Tussie to rhyme with pussy, not fussy, because she really loved cats, but she was never fussy. So if there's one thing you remember out of this talk, I hope that's it. Like that's the one takeaway. She's one thing that comes out of the book is that she was very human. She made mistakes. She made political mistakes. She made historical. She had historical foresight that proved inaccurate, but she also had a lot of ability to think about the long view of history. That's the way Rachel Holmes writes about that. And she was really ahead of her time in many ways. And for me, and one of the things that guides me in my reading of her is that she was the foremother of socialist feminism, and she saw them as twin struggles that you can't really separate, and you can't just be a feminist and not a socialist, and vice versa. And I think that's something that really resonates not only with her work that I'll be discussing today, but generally with things that we're engaged in. My work on Eleanor and my talk today is for mostly based on Rachel Holmes's work, so I do want to make that statement in the spirit of feminism. We stand on our sister's work. Basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about her biography, just so we get to know a little bit about her life, and also because it's really interesting. I won't put too many spoilers because I really think you should read the book. It's a wonderful book, but just to give us a little bit of grounding in her life story. So Eleanor was the youngest of all Marx children. Carl and Jenny Marx had several children who died very tragically, including a son who died when Eleanor was a young child. They had also two elder surviving daughters who were her elder sisters. She was the only Marx to be born in the UK, in England. She was born in a tiny flat in Soho on the 16th of January, 1855. And the Marx couple, apart from being political revolutionaries, political theorists, economists with a very strong heritage, were also refugees. They fled Germany and were persecuted for political work. And actually, both of Eleanor's elder sisters were born in Europe, in France and in Belgium. So Eleanor was raised into a very multilingual household, and something that's really crucial for her later work. She was also, and this is again thinking about feminism, socialism, where it can come from. In essence, she became the replacement child for the son who never survived, who was just a little bit older than her. And she became the family's favorite, and especially Karl Marx's favorite. And he was known to say Jenny, who's the eldest daughter. There was Jenny and Laura, one of her elder sisters, sorry. Jenny is most like me, but Tusi is me. So there was a very strong connection, and she became very close to him as a child and was really kind of homeschooled by him. And another interesting contradiction in her life is that on the one hand, she was the favorite daughter of perhaps the best political theorist and economist that we know, but also a Victorian woman who had no access to education, who was barred from a lot of institutions that we take for granted. But Karl took her as, his closest companion from a very young age. And later on, she became his private secretary, and she worked very closely with him. So again, she had access to knowledge that women of her time could only dream of. And she developed this awareness from a very young age. So she was aware that on the one hand, this is an extraordinary family, but on the other hand, women around her, including women she was very close to, didn't have the same fate as the men around her, including her beloved father. Another very important figure in this story that we need to think about is her beloved Uncle Angel, who we know more colloquially as Friedrich Engels. The families were very close together, and she was raised in both households. And especially again for her feminism, that was really important because Engels shared his life with two working class Irish sisters who were very important political mentors to her and who really showed her what life was like as a working class woman and what life was like in the factory, in the everyday. So again, on the one hand, she had this very strange bohemian lifestyle of being raised in the Marx family and I should say she was the first champagne socialist. At age 11, she said, my idea of happiness is champagne. But on the other hand, she had access to political struggles and to the lives of all people around her, including, again, very close family friends. So that's a tension that really defined her life between the extraordinary and sort of struggles that we know of now as history, but were very formative to her. Another thing that is really important to understand her on the whole is that the Marx family was very invested in literature and in culture, and acted plays in the living room and read Shakespeare together. And Eleanor understood the political power of literature from a very young age. She was the first translator, when she grew older, of Madame Bovary. She was the first person to put on A Doll's House in London, Ibsen's really innovative play, both of these works being very important feminist works, again, kind of staples of feminist kind of turn of a century radicalism. So she brought all these things together in a really interesting way. On the one hand, her passions and the things that were interesting to her from childhood and that she was really raised on, but on the other hand, nothing in her life wasn't political. So, like, she was political from top to toe. I'm kind of jumping between her childhood and also trying to understand her a little bit as adult, because I do want us to sort of talk a little bit about, also not a little bit, a lot about the political work. But I think the one thing that we see in Holmes's depiction of her, and also when we get to know the archives, and I do recommend so strongly to come to the MML for so many reasons, but even just for the 2C materials, it's worth your journey. You really see the contradictions again from being this really brilliant woman who's ahead of her time, who's able to understand processes that only just begun, and being constrained in the politics of her time and being constrained by societal norms and just oppression, really. And also the helplessness that comes from that, the helplessness that comes from being not where you can be, not fulfilling your potential. And then the sensitivity of being able to see that in other people. I don't want to do spoilers for the book, but Eleanor's personal life was equally interesting and full of drama, not less than her work on stage, even more. She knew many heartaches that were not only political. She learned the hard way about oppression between men and women that can't just be legislated around and campaigned for, but it's actually the thing that you battle in the household every day. But again, to learn more about that, I strongly recommend you read the book. And I do want to talk, just finally to segue into the political work. Another element of her life that is really important, as I mentioned, both her sisters were born outside of England and she was raised in England. She was really internationalist from child. So when she was born, Karl Marx writes to a friend and says, a global citizen is born. And from a very young age, she was raised in an international society. Her father's friends, people around her spoke many languages. She was acquainted with many struggles. There's that in her early letters, she writes about Irish politics. She writes about solidarity with the Polish people for independence. This is like age 8, right? So like this is like an early stage to show solidarity with someone. But especially, and this is something that I'll return to several times in the talk, at the same time as trade unionism develops in Britain, the Second International takes hold as the most important socialist organization of the time. And it really is a place where parties and trade unions work together and coordinate on similar causes and support each other. And Eleanor was a very important facilitator in that. And one reason I mentioned her bilingual upbringing and the fact that she was kind of raised with different communities and societies and languages is that it's really key for her role in that. She's very often the translator. She's very often the person who's able to transfer messages from one culture to another. And it's very intuitive to her. She doesn't even have to think about it. It's kind of very natural to her, just out of her upbringing. So trade unionism, internationalism kind of emerged as a twin phenomena, really, in the 1880s. And she is a very important radical force in both of them. I do want to just pause on one thing and talk about her socialist feminism, which is also kind of a pillar that unites her life. So in 1886, she writes a text called The Woman Question from a Post-Socialist Point of View with her then partner, Edward Aveling. And she reflects on something that I think, again, I'm kind of connecting it to a lot of things that we're discussing today. She critiques bourgeoisie feminism. She critiques middle-class feminism that ignores class, that ignores financial oppression. But on the other hand, she also critiques socialists who are happy to overlook the woman question. And the reason why I jumped into that from the previous comment is that so often we overlook women, especially in trade unions, especially in socialist organizations, who are the so-called secretaries or translators or whatever, but they do the most essential work and they actually make the organizations happen and they make the work come into being. And she not only embodies that, but she actually looks at that and she writes that very powerfully. So again, it's something that she lived as a practice, but also she writes about and she elucidates. And I think that's one aspect of her work that sadly we've not caught up with. I think sadly we still see that blind spot both within middle class bourgeoisie, if you will, white feminism, and on the other hand, socialists who say, no, the woman question, it's like, that's not for this lecture, it's for another lecture. So like, again, one legacy that I take out of 2C is that we always have to ask the woman question because it really is at the heart of every struggle we talk about. So when we talk about the twin giants, really, of the 1880s of trade unionism and socialist internationalism, in her radical circles, and again, talking about the turn of the century, Eleanor was close friends and mentors to Keir Hardie, to Will Thorne, to other leaders in the trade union movement. And from the end of 1880s until the early 1990s, she was really immersing herself in strategy and mobilization. She kind of became trade unionist to her core, and she became a really important figure in that moment. So the most important, I would say, the thing that we talk about in kind of the rupture of trade unionism, of new unionism, is the dock worker strike, where 50,000 dock workers who organized themselves brought London commerce to a standstill. This is really important. I'll return to it later from a different perspective. Again, how timely they struck over the issue of casual working. Amazing how little has changed in trade unionism. They had won over public imagination, were supported by international trade unions, and created a kind of radical tactics, such as strikes, such as public action, bring work to a standstill. We talk about mass mobilization, and we talk about socialist ideology. The dock workers' strike of 1889, I should say, followed after, and I'm glad that Louise is speaking after me, the 1886 Bryant and May Matchway Girls' strike. I won't have to go into that because you have a whole lecture on that. So like there's enough to be put there. But Eleanor was also involved in the Match Girls' strike. And it's very often and very clear that women's strikes start the process and then the men's strike come and create this kind of big rupture. So once again, the woman question, the fact that women are the ones who start organizing and then men kind of join or organize in different ways, and it becomes a new phenomenon. Eleanor was a very talented organizer. She was a very good orator. She wanted to be an actress. She loved the theater, but she could only act as herself. But she used that power to speak in gatherings, in meetings. And she was much loved and much admired in the trade union movements. And British socialists called her our old stoker and invited her to speak. And she indeed traveled across the country and spoke far and wide. At that point, I should say again, 1889 is the foundation of the Second Internationale. So she's immersed in these two big struggles at the same time. On the one hand, the emergence of trade unionism in the UK. On the other hand, kind of organizing of socialist parties, of trade unions internationally. And these are two things that will occupy her throughout her adult life, really. Unionism was the inception of grassroots organizing of workers, which we know today as trade unionism, representing themselves and their interests, and often using strikes and organized action to change legislation and political standing in society. The tactics are militant and an emphasis on mass participation. In terms of what these strikes were trying to achieve, and again, here the agenda is very close to the Second International, and there's a lot of overlap, and indeed for a reason. First and foremost, at that point was the 8-hour day, which was perhaps the most key figure in the Second International, and was indeed one of the things that those mass strikes in Britain at that point were mobilizing for. Working hours affected women much more than men. And indeed, a lot of the strikes that were occurring at the same time were women's strikes. And another issue that was central to those strikes, and again, to the Second International, by the way, I should say other figures you might know that were active in the Second International are Clara Zetkin, who was also a socialist feminist and worked very closely with Eleanor, and Rosa Luxemburg, about whom I wrote a book and is important to me in other ways. But again, these are figures that we still remember today and were kind of giants of the socialist movement, and were working very closely together and knew of each other's work and were inspired by each other. So another thing that the Second International and the trade union movement in the UK were mobilizing towards at that point was May Day, and founding it as a International Workers' Day. Again, I'm going to do shameless promotion for the MML. If you can come to May Day at the MML, you will not be disappointed. Please do that. It's a very important, very special day there. And indeed, carrying the legacy of Eleanor and Rosa and all others. So just to give you a little bit of a taste of Eleanor as a speaker and the way that she was mobilizing around those issues, I'm going to read a little bit from her speech on the first May Day, which was actually 1890, towards just after the dock workers' strike, but you'll see from the text that's very much in its spirit. We have not come to do the work of political parties, but we have come here in the cause of labor, in its own defense, to demand its own rights. I can remember when we came in handful of a dozen to Hyde Park to demand an 8-hour bill. And the dozens have grown to hundreds, and the hundreds to thousands, until we have this magnificent demonstration that fills the park today. We are standing face to face with another demonstration, but I am glad to see that the great masses of people are on our side. Those of us who have gone through the worry of the dock strike, and especially the gas workers' strike, which I should have mentioned, but another really important strike in which Eleanor was involved, I'll talk about that in a second, and have seen the men and women and children stand around us, have had enough of strikes, and we are determined to secure an 8-hour day by legal enactment. Unless we do so, it will be taken from us at the first opportunity. We will only have ourselves to blame if we do not achieve the victory which this great day could so easily give us. We must not be like some Christians who sin for 6 days and go to church on the 7th, but we must speak for the cause daily and make the men, and especially the women, that we meet come into the ranks to help us. And then she pulls out her Shelley, knowing the political power of culture, and reads a short verse then that I think all of us campaigning will recognize. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. So once again, talking about her legacy and how it lives on, I always find it very moving. Just to go back a little bit on myself, I jumped over the gas workers' strike, which is actually really important. So Eleanor was one of the first mobilizers as a close friend of Will Thorne in the then gas workers union that organized the strike in 1898. The gas workers' strike today is the GMB, so there's a historical legacy there that is still honoring her memory. It was commented, not by Will Thorne, but someone else, that Tusi leads the gasmen undercover, and this union certainly seems to be by far the best. So again, there's a question of women leadership in unions and what that means in terms of who gets credit and who gets to do the manual work behind the scenes. She was also very involved in the Silvertown Union and was appointed to be on the board of that. So she was pioneering really in, first of all, organizing women's chapters of unions and also becoming a woman leader on the executive committee, something that was really uncommon at that point. And again, important for us to remember at this moment. I do want to jump ahead a little bit to our time and think about, so I threw out some ideas as I went along, but I do want to talk a little bit about our current struggles and where we can see her legacy and where we can still learn from her, maybe. Obviously, Britain has this beautiful, long history of women striking, organizing, creating change in society, from the Dagenham strike, then the exchange with Barbara Castle ending up in the Equal Pay Act. So again, if you think about her rationale that we have to strike in order to change legislation, we have to have radical action in order to change formal politics. That's very much something that lives with us today. More contemporary examples that I'm sure we all remember was the incredible Glasgow women's strike, and the still ongoing Birmingham equal pay struggle. And all the examples I chosen were not coincidentally struggles led by women, and especially women in sectors in which they are significantly underpaid and in which they are, compared to their male companions, are disenfranchised still. So again, the fight for equality between women and men in paid conditions and in the socialist movement is something that is ongoing. But we definitely see the legacy of women organizing themselves and working to change through trade unionism, something that lives on in our time. The GMB, after the publication of Rachel Holmes's book, has really brought back Eleanor Marx into its heritage and now gives an award on Eleanor Marx Day, the Eleanor Marx Award for Outstanding Trade Unionist in the Union. So I think that there are ways in which she still speaks to us and sort of speaks to the trade union movement at this moment. Another place that, and I have to concede and talk a little bit about my work and why she speaks to me and how I came to write about her. Eleanor Marx was the only Marx who claimed the Jewish roots of her family. Karl Marx was not known to really, be proud of being a Jew. And Eleanor, at quite a mature stage of her life, actually started declaring publicly, I am a Jewess, and kind of claimed the heritage of her family. But it was a very specific context, and I think that's where it becomes interesting in the context of this talk. Specifically, between the late 1880s, the beginning of the 1890s, there was a development of Jewish trade unions, especially at the East End. And many trade unions didn't want to organize together with Jews, and then Jews formed their own trade unions. And as with today, and we can't really talk about the way that racism, sexism are not part of socialist politics. And at that time, Eleanor recognized that. And then she kind of offered solidarity. And again, to quote from her, she was invited to speak at one of the foundational meetings of those trade unions, of those Jewish trade unions. And she replies, "Dear comrade, I shall be very glad to speak at the meeting of November 1st, very close to where we are today, all the more glad that my father was a Jew." She learned Yiddish, maybe also in order to communicate with those workers. And she generally reclaimed the family's Jewish heritage, but again, it was under the understanding of solidarity and of countering racism. Looking at our times, I am half Israeli, half Welsh, and I'm speaking to you today from Tel Aviv. And I have been an activist in the pro-Palestine movement since I was 14. And it's something that is the core of what I think and do, and especially after 2 years of genocide, not only 2 years, but especially these last 2 years. If we think in terms of international solidarity, and again, the gas workers and the dock workers strike were very much supported by international solidarity, we think about what's happening here in Palestine. Of course, everything has been completely devastated by both in the West Bank and in Gaza, and indeed outside of that. But especially trade unions, a lot of trade unions buildings have been destroyed during Israel's bombings. A lot of trade unionists have been abducted, questioned, trade unions have been unable to hold meetings to advocate for workers' rights. Conditions for work have been completely unsafe over the past, definitely 2 years, but even beyond that. In the West Bank, we can discuss that. And by the way, feel free to also ask me about that in the Q&A. I'm very happy to take questions about that part of my work. There has been a widespread economic collapse in Gaza, with unemployment reaching around 60% youth unemployment, which is kind of a hideous number. At the same time, it should be noted that international solidarity and the fact that unions can actually outreach and create outreach and offer forms of solidarity that other organizations can't has been very apparent, has been very visible, whether it's various actions. And I know, again, it's been really inspiring. I've been here throughout and like to see trade unions doing blockages of arms factories, of trying to sort of disrupt the arms trade, general shutdowns that unions had organized in support of Palestine. This is also true, of course, across Europe. There was a general strike in Italy just very recently, just before the ceasefire, so-called ceasefire, in which there was basically the whole reason for the general strike was in order to stand with Palestine and to say, shut down until this ends. And one aspect that I want to sort of dwell on a little bit is the dock workers strike, which again, I think in kind of nice historical continuity, we know that organized action of dock workers, both in Spain, Italy, and the UK, in which they had either refused or threatened to refuse unloading Israeli cargo ships, refusing to unload or load arms. And I know that recently there have been other actions of refusing to take luggage, all sorts of like shipments. These actions express solidarity with the Palestinians and oppose any economic support to Israeli military operations. In Spain, some dock workers in Barcelona and Valencia voiced intentions or took steps to block or delay cargo ships arriving from Israel. That's another important action. And again, on the 22nd of September 2025, there was a general strike in Italy under the heading "Let's Block Everything," aimed at implementing a nationwide block of ports. So again, the significance of the dock workers strike within unionism, we see a kind of recurrence of that in a kind of solidarity movement of workers worldwide with Palestine. And the attempt in this strike, and indeed in all these actions, was to stop the shipments of arms and supplies to Israel. So in Eleanor Marx's days, as in our times, it's impossible to disconnect oppressions faced globally by workers and our local struggles. So again, I think for me, it's really important to talk about that even just a little bit. And again, I'm happy to expand in the Q&A. We can't disconnect what's happening in Palestine from the silencing of freedom of speech across the world, from the oppression felt by immigrants, by minorities. Again, it's really interesting and sadly very timely to read about the way that immigrants and foreigners, so-called, however you can define foreigners in London, definitely in the 19th century and still today, it's a city that is so diverse and so open. But the emergence of racism, discrimination within the socialist movement itself, we can't disconnect that from the socialist cause as a whole. And with the emergence of new unionism, we see the emergence of internationalism as socialist coordination, and we see the kind of development of socialist feminism, and all these things happen together. So when we think about our struggles today, we can really sort of try and connect the dots and try to see how we speak to the men and women that we meet and bring them into the ranks to help us. So I think I'll stop there for now.